It's safe to say that nobody alive today has seen anything like what the world is seeing unfold right now, and that makes it historic, for sure. But will history also note this as a major turning point for our world? To consider this big question, let us turn to Doug Saunders. He is a Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow of the Robert Bosch Academy and International Affairs columnist for the Globe and Mail. He's in Berlin, Germany, joining us via Skype. Also via Skype in Washington, D.C., Yascha Mounk, Associate Professor of the Practice, Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And in Waterloo, Ontario, via FaceTime, there's Ann Fitz-Gerald. She is the director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs and a professor of political science at Wilfrid Laurier University. And it's great to have three familiar faces back on our program. I'm going to start by just reading something that Andrew Sullivan recently wrote in a piece, and it goes like this. All plagues change society and culture, reversing some trends while accelerating others, shifting consciousness far and wide with consequences we won't discover for years or decades. The one thing we know about epidemics is that at some point they will end. One thing we don't know is who we will be then. Yascha, let's go to you first. What does your gut tell you about whether this pandemic has placed us in the middle of an historical break with the past?
Well, look, the first lesson that Andrew Sullivan draws very well in that piece is that the consequences of a pandemic aren't always obvious. He was writing in part about the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And of course, at the time, it would have been easy to imagine that it would lead to more condemnation of homosexuality, more bigotry towards LGBTQ people. And in fact, we now know that it did the opposite. That because of the terrible suffering within that community and the activism that came out of it, today we have same-sex marriage on the book in a lot of countries around the world. So I think that we need to be careful about some of the pronouncements that people are making right now, saying this will be the end of globalization, or some of the people who want to sell the same solutions they've been peddling for the last 25 years. If people thought that we should abolish all international organizations, now they're saying, you see, the pandemic proves it. If they want to abolish capitalism and institute a very different economic system, they're looking at this pandemic and they're saying, now this proves it. I think both of those approaches are rather naive. There is no good precedent for what's happening right now, but in terms of the last major turning point we've seen in our politics, I would look to 9/11. And what happened after 9/11 is vast changes in particular areas of our lives, in international relations, in the surveillance state, very important changes. But large parts of our lives continued mostly unchanged. Unlike what people thought in the weeks after 9/11, there's still big sporting events. A lot of our life has gone on the same as it did before. And I imagine that something similar will happen here. Radical changes in some areas, probably including public health, probably fewer changes than we might be imagining right now in a lot of other areas.
Let's get the view from a couple of hours down the 401. And are we at a moment in history where decades from now, people are going to look back and say, wow, this is the way things were before COVID and after COVID?
Well, I would agree with Yascha's comments, but I would also add that what people will look back and recognize is that this is something unprecedented in as much as it has affected every single citizen around the world at relatively similar times and at similar paces. And as a result, we're seeing a global behavioral change moving forward at the same time. And this isn't normal. Yascha drew on some examples like gay marriages. We could even look at drinking and driving and other issues that we have seen take root in different societies at different times and at different paces. But it reminds us that the interconnectedness of the world has never been more pronounced as it is now. So I think what will be interesting to see is the resultant attitudinal and behavioral changes.
Doug, you're a long way away from us. What's your sense of the historic nature of the moment and whether it really is a breaking off point to what comes next?
What makes this different from an event like September 11th is, while I agree with both of the professors that we should not be extrapolating from the emergency measures that we're taking right now to assume that society is going to change some way to permanently take the shape of these temporary emergency measures. One thing that we will come out of this with that will have changed us is that the democracies of the world will have undergone a large-scale mass project, the likes of which we have not engaged in since the 2 world wars. We've had governments of democracies ask hundreds of millions of people to change their behavior, corporations to change their behavior in ways that are not to their self-interest and that are very dramatic, and based on what for most people is still an abstract threat. Most people don't know anybody who's died of this. And although we in the media have paid our attention to those who are shirking or being irresponsible, I think on the whole what's happened is that hundreds of millions of people have gone along with this. So we've had a mass mobilization on a scale that we have not seen in close to a century. And it's been largely successful. We're now seeing the deployment of trillions of public sector dollars to keep the economy aloft in a way that has not happened since the Second World War. It may well be that we'll return afterwards to something very close to what we had before, and I suspect we will not want to do the things that conservatives like about this, which is shutting down immigration. We will not want to completely do the things that people on the left like of this, which is massive basic income redistribution schemes and so on. But we will know that we are capable. We have the levels of social capital and social trust. We have the capacities of states to do very large-scale things with mass support. And that lesson may be something that is picked up afterwards.
Well, you mentioned conservatives, so this feels like a good time to quote conservatives, one of their, anyway, favorite economists, certainly Ronald Reagan's favorite economist, who once mused about the benefits of a crisis 60 years ago. He had this to say. Milton Friedman said, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable." Okay, Yascha, pick up on that. This is sort of, I guess he said it before Rahm Emanuel did, Obama's former chief of staff, when he said, you never want to let a good crisis go to waste. Do you agree that there are some potential opportunities that this crisis presents? And if so, what might they be?
Look, yes, I agree with the opportunities that this crisis presents. I do think it's very important that we remember, or at least we preface these conversations with an awareness that this crisis itself is what matters right now, which is to say that there are lots of political causes that I deeply care about, which I think can save people's lives, improve people's lives, make our societies better, more just, more fair, more beautiful. But right now, the right or the wrong measures in the coming weeks and months will make the difference globally between millions of people living and millions of people dying. And so I think it's important to adjust our way of thinking about this in order to be sure that we're not forgetting about the momentous choices we're facing right now, because we're so interested in all the causes that we've invested emotional energy in over the last 10 or 20 years. Now, having said all of that, I do think that there are some opportunities for that. I think one opportunity is that some of the deeply unjust policies, especially in the United States, where I am right now, are finally remedied, that people have proper sick pay, that people don't feel an obligation to go to work if they are unwell, that we improve access to the health system, so there aren't people who are uninsured, who don't go to the doctor when they might need medical care because they're not sure that they'll be able to make rent if they do so. I think all of those things hopefully will improve, and that would make a real difference. I also wonder whether there can be two political lessons from this period. The first political lesson is that people like me have been warning about the dangers of populism for a long time. And often those warnings seem rather abstract. In good times, it's hard to explain to people why it's so dangerous, why it's so harmful when experts aren't being listened to, when political institutions become subject to political will and political whims, when prime ministers and presidents lie so much that people can't trust they're good intentions. Well, the United States is paying a very heavy price for all of those things right now. The same is true in Brazil, the same is true in Mexico, the same is true wherever populists rule, right-wing or for that matter, left-wing. And so hopefully people will learn the lesson that these warnings actually were very serious, precisely because of moments like this. And then the last hope I have, perhaps, is that when we compare the current moment to World War I, to World War II, to those other moments of mass social mobilization, there was a spirit of solidarity. There was an ability to transcend, at least for a few years in the aftermath of these crises, the deep partisan divisions that had riven many societies. And it may be too optimistic, but perhaps there will be a moment of solidarity like that after this crisis, which makes our society, our politics, our daily life together a little less dysfunctional than it had become in so many societies over the last decades.
Anne, if I may, let me get you to pick up on one of the angles that Yascha just pursued there, and that is, I suspect many people watching us right now have either read or heard of Tom Nichols' very good book, The Death of Expertise. And I wonder if this moment in time is one of those moments where we're going to realize actually a little bit of expertise right now is probably a really good thing. And maybe this represents, if not a death knell for stupid, mindless populism, at least a bit of a setback. I don't know. What's your thought on that?
No, I would strongly support the opportunity that's presented that appreciates the scientific community more going forward. But I would go beyond that and also say that we should appreciate science that is not settled. Science is never settled, and settled science becomes politicized science. So it's not just drawing on scientific expertise, it's doing this in a continuous way. And we have to have the right structures in order to do that and move away from keeping so much research capacity perhaps in government and generate new structures that are two-way in nature. Civil society, identify what kind of civil society organizations that we need and how government will work with those civil society organizations going forward. We need to be, there will be another black swan punch that we will get sometime down the road. It might be a climate change black swan punch. And so we need to be more black swan robust and invest in things such as offices of national security advisors, offices that have been worldwide very underfunded and very under-resourced for years. So, I would say that that's the big opportunity that presents itself here. And if I can take it one step further, we need these complex and wicked problems require multidisciplinary approaches. And, as societies, even in higher education, we're still not totally well kitted out to support multidisciplinarity. So it's not just identifying the right civil society groups that we need, the people who raise money, the people who look after the population in times of crisis, the people who usefully inform government policy. It's putting the structures in place, and it's bringing in leadership at every level of society, government, civil society, and the population itself.
Doug, since you write for the Globe and Mail, I should put a recent Globe and Mail editorial headline to you and get you to comment on that. The headline was, "When a virus strikes, the world needs an outbreak of good leadership." As you scan the globe from there in Berlin, Germany, are you seeing examples of it?
I'm seeing it here in Europe, and I've generally been impressed with the way Canadian governments at both the federal and provincial level have exercised leadership. Even the more populist-minded premiers in Canada have rallied to the cause and been responsible and so on. I think there were, during the last decade, a number of what are often called populist leaders, angry right-wing leaders who were elected in countries like the Philippines and Brazil and the United States, basically to take advantage of fears, rational or otherwise, felt by their voters. And I think those leaders have proven to be the ones who are responding in the most hesitant and frankly frightening ways that threaten to multiply the death toll of this. And not only that, there's a second set of problems, which is that we need to be able to maintain the economy and people's livelihoods during this crisis, however long it lasts, not just for its own sake, not just because people need to be able to have the dignity of life and employment and keep payments on their houses and so on, but because there's a real risk that will come out of this with a period of economic decline if we don't do that. It's very hard to get an economy back going again if you've allowed people's employment patterns and housing patterns to be disrupted. And I'm hoping we will see governments recognize the importance of this, the importance of risking large levels of debt like we saw in the Second World War in order to keep the economy going. Because as Dr. Fitz-Gerald said, there's a risk that we will be vulnerable after this to other crises that are equally deadly. We have a looming climate crisis that's within a couple decades of costing lives and well-being of millions of people. We need to have really strong economic growth to be able to pay for the changes in how we produce energy and so on, to be able to make ourselves resilient and get to a carbon neutral economy. If we produce an economic depression because of short-sighted responses to this crisis, we could be much more vulnerable and lacking in investment and resources that we need to respond to the next big global crisis.
Yascha, let me ask you, since we're talking about crises here, about a potential crisis that democracy finds itself in right now. We see that in Hungary, Viktor Orban is about to get a legal mandate to rule essentially by decree. No sunset clause, no parliamentary oversight. And I wonder whether you worry about the crisis of liberal democracies turning into illiberal democracies, whether this pandemic sets the stage for more of that.
Well, certainly there are some populist leaders who are already exploiting the crisis in order to give themselves plenipotentiary powers. And Viktor Orban, who is always the shrewdest and the most far-sighted enemy of democracy, we've seen within developed Western democracies, is writing the playbook, as indeed he wrote the playbook for how to start undermining institutions when he was elected about a decade ago. So, he has suspended parliament. He has the right to basically decree the laws of a country, and he has even instituted measures against quote-unquote false rumors on social media, which allow the government to jail not just anybody who says wrong things about COVID, but most likely also people who criticize the government. There is a very real danger that governments around the world will start to follow that lead. Now, at the same time, we are, of course, in a moment in which some extraordinary measures really are necessary. It really might be necessary for governments to ensure that people who have been diagnosed with COVID or who are suspected of being likely to develop the disease because of their close contact with somebody who is infected need to stay home, because it's only by ensuring that effective quarantine that we will be able to get this disease under control and restore everybody's freedom to go about their lives and to have fun and to eat out in restaurants and to be economically productive as quickly as possible. So I think what people who are concerned about the stability of our political system need to be doing now is to avoid the temptation of resisting any kind of government measure, even from people who have reason to mistrust, like Donald Trump, just because it's unprecedented, because some of those really are necessary. But we also have to insist that all of those measures be temporary and that they be strictly tailored to the actual needs of the pandemic. Suspending parliament, ruling by decree, locking people up who say things the government doesn't like on social media does not fall under that category.
Yeah, Ann, I wonder if I can get you to follow up on that. And from this point of view, and I'm going to stress, even before I ask the question, I'm going to throw an example out here that I don't want in any way anyone to infer that I'm comparing what Viktor Orban is doing with what's been happening in this country right now. I merely make the comparison that, Doug Ford, as the Premier of Ontario, has been acting more like a moderate, pragmatic, progressive conservative than the sort of bombastic populist he got elected to be. Whereas it was Justin Trudeau who came under a great deal of criticism earlier this week for introducing measures that were much more anti-democratic than anybody thought he had a right to do, anybody except maybe his inner circle. As you look around the world, or as you consider this issue, How careful does the populace have to be right now to ensure that governments don't overstep and take advantage and exploit this moment?
Well, if you look at countries that are using slightly more dictatorial means, I think the point that Yascha made about the temporary nature of our measures is an important one. We still have special powers acts. We still have military aid to the civil authority, but these are used as temporary measures. And also, I think it's important to remember that different societies and governments have different definitions of privacy, and will exercise around that definition in various ways. Now, we're hearing a lot about the difference between the East and the West approaches, and I think it's important to remember that East and West isn't all just about geography, right? It's about cultural ideology. Many of these Eastern countries that we refer to are observe Confucian culture and national discipline, a sense of hierarchy and harmony are defining features of not just that culture, but also the homogeneous society. And as a result, they come together and rally around the collective good, and they prioritize rallying around that. And we've seen how important national discipline is during times of crisis. And more individualistic societies, I think it has to be recognized that individualism can pose a weakness in times of crisis. And so national discipline is important. We've seen how these benefits have played out in countries like China, which had a rocky start, but has stepped up. Not just in terms of helping others, but also in terms of opening schools again and putting the right healthcare provisions in place. Countries like Singapore, Taiwan, even better, even the national discipline that we see in Germany at the moment.
Well, Doug, I should ask you about that then. Do you think Asian countries have proved themselves to be superior to Western democracies at this moment? I mean, Ann is quite right. China, even though this thing started there, if they are to be believed, seem to have a handle on this thing right now. South Korea is getting plaudits all over the world for the way they've handled this thing and planked their curve right away. What do you see?
Keep in mind that this would not be a global pandemic now if it had not been for the fact that the Chinese regime had covered it up and kept it secret and tried to prevent it moving for the first 2 months. When we look at very responsible behavior from China, we're looking at what they did after 2 months of hiding it and letting it spread and so on.
Great point.
I mean, everything we've seen about how pandemics spread suggests that well-run democracies are better at controlling infection rates and so on than autocratic countries are, regardless of their culture or region. Japan has done very well. Singapore has done very well. I look outside my window here at this park in what is normally a very chaotic city of Berlin, and I see people falling into line and staying many meters away from each other, and so on. On the other hand, yes, there's been some irresponsible leadership in democracies that worries me a lot. Having the President of the United States engage, even at this late hour, in conspiracy theories or denialism about the scope of this pandemic is extremely dangerous. So I think it's, I don't think we can draw any conclusions yet about whether certain cultures or certain forms of government are superior for fighting these things. But it has been refreshing to see that in pluralist democratic societies, hundreds of millions of people, as I said earlier, have come in line behind government instructions that are against their own interests. So for people who are worried about trust in democracies and social capital and social cohesion, we've been seeing a lot more of that than its opposite.
We're down to our last few minutes here, and I want to read one more thing. This is the economic historian Adam Tooze, whom I suspect you all know, who had this to say about what we're going through. And if I can get you all to give very brief responses coming out, we'll get everybody in for one more round. Adam Tooze wrote in the Washington Post a couple of days ago, "We are where we are because we were too slow. because we allowed the virus to overwhelm us, because the resources of our government have been gutted, and because our politics are dysfunctional. In our circumstances, historical analogies can easily become a form of dangerous nostalgia. This isn't 1914, it isn't 1941, it isn't even 2008. It's 2020, so expect all hell to break loose. Yascha, briefly, when you imagine all hell breaking loose, what are you seeing?
Well, I mean, certainly the worst case scenario, for example, in the United States, is that Donald Trump does decide in a week or so from now to declare victory on the virus and to reopen the country, at which point cases would start spiraling in an exponential fashion again. Healthcare systems, which are already at breaking points in cities like New York right now, would become completely overwhelmed. We would see the death, on a conservative estimate, of over 1 million people, which is more than the United States lost in the Civil War and World War I and World War II combined. And on top of all of that, there would be an incredible loss of public trust as people are unable to access doctors for what normally would be quite routine emergencies, as people are clamoring to get treatment and engaging in conspiracy theories about who gets treatment, why. This could indeed get very, very badly. Now, I'm still hopeful that that is not going to be the case, that we can avoid all hell breaking loose, but the danger of that is certainly real.
And what do you see?
Right. I'll go further afield and perhaps draw on the start of cases appearing in countries like Syria, the fear of other countries hosting huge refugee populations, such as Bangladesh, Ethiopia, South Sudan, others. Ethnic violence is at risk here, particularly in diverse societies where the potential spread of the virus may affect some groups more than others. And we may even see, based on the way that some of these insurgent groups like Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Taliban in Afghanistan, the Islamic State, will have their power reasserted in some cases and possibly undermined in others. And while I won't add any more on the United States, which is suffering from a moral leadership deficiency for sure at the moment, Russia will be the interesting case to watch here because of the Saudi price war on oil that they've been having. They will be tremendously economically strained. And the government's response to the spread of the virus will dictate the extent to which the uprising may be the sequel to even more of the current unrest that we're seeing now. And if this happens,
let me jump in. I'm down to my last 30 seconds, so I want to give Doug Saunders, a chance to get in. Doug, wrap it up for us, if you would.
We're having this conversation at a moment before the real tragedy has occurred. The majority of deaths, however many they turn out to be from this crisis, are going to occur in the future and starting in the near future. So I think any conclusions, optimistic or pessimistic, that we draw about how the future will be shaped have to be painted against the backdrop of the fact that we will be in deep mourning of a great many lives lost. We don't know exactly where or exactly how many, but that is going to put this in a very different context starting in the near future.
Yascha Mounk from the Johns Hopkins University, Doug Saunders from the Robert Bosch Academy, Ann Fitz-Gerald from the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Really good of all of you to join us on TVO tonight for a very important and timely conversation. Be safe, you three, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.